So this leads me to another question, which will be particularly interesting to our audience, namely the figure of migrants. As you mentioned earlier, I mean, wonderful point again, it's not a shock-induced mobility of migrants. It probably, I mean, in a way, a small shock-induced mobility, but the mobility creates a real large-scale shock, and that shock is not about virus, but is about the bodies of migrants. But the body of migrants became a sign of shock, is predicted on a condition that these bodies were invisible before. I mean, the bodies of migrants were there, physically, they're always there, but they were there in a different way as in during the shock. So Ranabir, can you shed light on two questions? Number one, empirically, why is the figure of migrants, while they are so important economically, we know the informal sector, etc., is vital for the Indian economy, why the figure has been so invisible to the mainstream society, middle class? Of course, they know the migrants were there, but they're never part of the consciousness. And then the shock came, suddenly they became visible last year. But again, now this year, the figure of migrants did not appear to be particularly shocking, right? People, I mean, this time all the report is more about the urban residents. So how shall we understand the visibility, invisibility is moving? And the second question is more theoretical. That is also a kind of a very important feature of your books, is take the figure of migrants, the why we call it the figure of migrants rather than migrants per se, because the figure, it is representing a certain social force and a certain social relations, right? The migrants is always a migrant in certain social relations. So do you have any sort of suggestions to migration and mobility scholars? How can we use the figure of migrants as a tool or as a subject of thinking to develop more general theories and social critiques, rather than just to talk about the migrants' individual experiences per se, which is many, I would say, English literature or migration studies do. They always say, oh, how migrants' individuals experience, I mean, which are very important, but we want to say their experiences should be treated as a figure of certain figuration of social forces. And how can we go to a higher level of analysis? Yeah, higher level, not necessarily more abstract, but deeper, right?
Just to clarify something that I told, I mean, what I wanted to say was that some of the governments that did whatever they could, certainly they could have done better. But when they went in for re-elections, they never placed that they have treated the migrants in this way, etc., as their strong point. The idea was that, oh, this was a duty we had to do. And political parties, political activists belonging to different parties, they had also done quite a lot, in as much as other solidarity activists also did huge. Actually, they did probably more than the political parties, but this was never politically theorized, or this was never politically capitalized in terms of elections and all that. So that set me into thinking that perhaps, and I'm not very sure, as I told you, that I'm only thinking, and I had been thinking of that the last few years, that to think of migrant as a usual political subject is not to think of the migrant. We are thinking of the migrant as a settled subject of politics. As you think of the peasant, as you think of the worker, as you think of the student, etc., or as you think of parties. The migrant is a migrant, and the figure therefore suggests continuous transcending of boundaries. In India, it was boundaries of different states in the country, boundaries of cities, boundaries of restrictions of the government, and boundaries of your ideas of safety. And they kept on moving and moving. So now to expect that that migrant will appear as a subject of politics, framed in liberal terms, is simply a failed exercise. We are, we are simply, I mean, in our, what do you say? We have a famous saying by an author who said that that you can't find aubergines in a cotton field. In a cotton field, you will find only cotton. So the migrant as a figure of liberal politics is something either usual right-wing anti-liberals will use migrant as something, or you may have a different kind of politics, which I am suggesting, biopolitics from below, where the migrant can become. But to think of migrant as a figure of, as a subject is a contradiction in terms. Now, why? And this takes me to your main question, that the way in which visibility and invisibility play out, the dialectics of visibility and invisibility play out in our society, is something that we need to study. I mean, if you see, for so long, the migrant was seen, or the refugee was seen, most of the time I'm thinking of refugee, let's say, was seen as a subject of protection, as a subject of care. And therefore, Hannah Arendt's formulation was, after a point, meaningless when you say that migrant is a subject of statelessness, or the subject who doesn't have rights. Because a subject which doesn't have rights, a subject which doesn't have a state, a subject which, for all purposes, is driven, is not a subject at all. So how do you solve that riddle? On one hand, you want to think of the migrant. On the other hand, the moment you think of migrant and the refugee, then you say, oh, he or she may have little bit rights, but the main situation is the rightlessness. Now, bourgeois society resolved that question in terms of solving this paradox of visibility and invisibility by making migrant visible as the object of your protection. So think of Refugee Convention in 1951, or the 1967 Protocol. Think of the Statelessness Convention, many other things, where your purpose is to protect the victims of forced migration, give him or her asylum, etc., etc. And politically and economically, he or she doesn't play a role. But as neoliberalism progressed and the society and the economy became much more aware of the productive power, quote and unquote, the productive power of the migrant, then that the migrant was conceptualized as someone who can also produce, who is a market-enabled actor, and who can therefore contribute to the market. So, the redevising of UN strategy, the global compacts, everything, where that in order to have a just society, a developmental society, think of the millennial goals and all that, the idea is to make the migrant an economically powerful agent. So you have all the programs of making camp the sites of small-scale production, educating the migrants, offering public health access. Basically, the idea is the migrant is not an idle subject. The migrant can also produce and contribute to the market society. So think in terms of the writings by Alex Betts and his colleagues, and I can go on referring to that, to this new idea of thinking. And therefore, this whole thesis of resilience, that the migrant is a resilient subject. Don't think that the migrant is a victim, but the migrant is a resilient subject. So you have already moved away from Hannah. Neoliberalism has allowed you to think along different lines. But what happens to politics then? Then in politics, the migrant is invisible. The migrant is visible in economy. So you think of construction industry, you think of logistical industry, you think of the supply chain, you think of shipping industry, you think of massive kinds of unorganized sector in this world. The migrant is economically very much visible. Think of the apparel industry from Bangladesh, the garment industry. Millions of workers are there. And if you take the ILO figures, actually in the last decade, the workers' figures have trebled. It's a huge growth in the number of figures. And it's not only China which has contributed to the number of the global figure of the workers, but worldwide you have a massive expansion of unorganized industry and unorganized worker. But the way to expand and make the migrant crucial economy is precisely through the way to make him or her politically silent. Politically, the migrant cannot be allowed to take the center stage. It must happen in economy. So you have, in a way, the situation which Marx faced in terms of his theoretical inquiry, when Marx was arguing, look, society, look through institutions of democracy, parliament, new bourgeois parties are coming of age, Chartists have come, etc. But that's not what the society is. As if the society has a cover over it. Remove the cover. Take out the blanket, and then you will see actually worms and actually insects and actually dirt and so many things in the society. It is, if in his word, that you don't have to be a great scholar to understand, it is the economy which counts. But the task of politics is to keep that cover. Now, I'm not saying that, but today, the migrant crisis appeared precisely because the migrant appeared on the scene. They made themselves visible. They came out on the roads. They died in hundreds. They captured newspaper headlines. They invoked solidarity among different sections of society, and they, in a way, crystallized all the contradictions that had been unleashed in the wake of the corona. So the migrant crisis and the corona crisis, as if they were progressing simultaneously. As if the migrant crisis was an equally powerful thing that was driving the society towards, driving it further. So the task of the order is then to manage it and again put the lid on that economy which depends so much on the migrants and the refugees as productive labor, and make that as if politics is appearing as normal, as usual, as if this was a transient phenomenon, as if this was temporary. So the dialectics of visibility and invisibility is extremely important. That the migrant has to be a market-enabled actor, but the migrant must not appear as a politically crucial factor. It is not. Therefore, when you see electoral politics, you find even those who came out in solidarity with the migrant workers did not think that this was an occasion to intervene with the migrant question. The migrant question is simply an outside. It constitutes the outside of the mainstream structure of politics.
That's I completely agree. The Chinese scholar, Professor Wang Hui, you may know, and he asked a very interesting question. The 21st century China, the huge number of working class population, as you said, worldwide, actually, the number of working class population and wage labor increased, I think, by 4 times over last decades. Economically speaking, it is a time of working class. Politically speaking, there's no working class politics. There's no working class culture, which is a very interesting contrast to the 1920s or 1930s China. At that time, there was no working class population, but it has a very vibrant working class politics and working class culture. So the relation between the economy and the politics is certainly not mechanical, one determine another, but it is very dynamic, which also means that there's a space for intellectual intervention. And the second point I learned from you, Ranabir, is about the question of migrants, which is so often projected as a subject for protection and so therefore victim, rather than a genuine political actor. I mean, if we talk to lots of radical migration scholars, they are very criticized, but lots of their activities thinking is still thinking migrants as victims. Migrants has to be saved, rescued, right? And the state is simply suppressive. So therefore, certain migration control policy must be removed. The borders have to be removed. I mean, they are all legitimate arguments, but by I'm thinking that is in my view, is how politics is being distorted or understood differently from what we understand, right? The politics become a politics of identity, politics of liberal rights protection, and the politics of, and it's kind of a legal instrument, how to implement the legal instrument fairly and equally. And the problem is that now it seems that it is a battle we will never be able to win, because this is a battle inside of this liberal bourgeois logic, right? So now the point, I mean, the figure of migrants, or why it is suddenly invisible, suddenly visible, as you point out, precisely because the migrant does not play with this logic. They are outside, radical outsiders, even though economically they're deeply inside. So how to, I suppose, capture this contradiction and conceptualize it, it will be very important, because it will give us new fire, new fuel in thinking the crisis, and also thinking larger politics. Yeah.